Sarah Martinez had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 30, 2 years old, she worked the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Chicago, moving through the sterile hallways like a ghost in Scrubs. Her colleagues knew her as the quiet one, the nurse who always volunteered for the difficult cases, who never complained about working holidays or pulling double shifts when someone called in sick. She lived alone in a small apartment 15 minutes from the hospital, sharing her space only with a tabby cat named Oliver she had rescued from the hospital parking lot 2 years ago. Her life followed a predictable routine: work, sleep, grocery shopping on Tuesdays, laundry on Sundays, and occasional coffee with her neighbor, Mrs. Andar. Chen, an elderly widow who appreciated having someone to talk to about her late husband's stories from the Korean War. The other nurses at St. Kater, Mary's often wondered about Sarah's personal life. She never talked about dating, rarely mentioned family, and seemed to have no social media presence whatsoever. When pressed about weekend plans, she would smile politely and mention reading or gardening on her small balcony. This mysterious quality made her something of an enigma among the staff, though no one would have guessed the depth of that mystery. Dr. James Patterson, one of the emergency room physicians, had tried asking Sarah out several times over the past year. Each time she politely declined with the same gentle smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm just not in a place for dating right now," she would say. And something in her tone always made him drop the subject immediately. The truth was that Sarah carried secrets that would have shocked her coworkers. Her quiet demeanor wasn't born from shyness or introversion. It was carefully cultivated armor, designed to keep people at a safe distance. She had learned long ago that the less people knew about her, the safer everyone would be. Her apartment reflected this need for anonymity. The furniture was generic, bought from discount stores and assembled quickly. There were no family photos on the walls, no personal mementos cluttering the shelves. The only hints of personality came from her extensive collection of medical textbooks and a small herb garden on the balcony where she grew plants that most people wouldn't recognize. Sarah's colleagues would have been surprised to learn that she spoke 4 languages fluently and could manage basic conversation in 3 others. They would have been even more surprised to know that she held advanced degrees in both nursing and pharmacology, credentials she had never mentioned during her hiring process at St. Mary's. Her resume listed only the basic qualifications necessary for her position. The skills that truly set Sarah apart were ones that would never appear on any resume. She could move through a room without making a sound, pick most standard locks in under 30 seconds, and identify dozens of plant-based toxins by smell alone. These weren't skills typically associated with pediatric nursing, but they had served her well in a previous life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Her transformation into Sarah Martinez, night shift nurse, had taken nearly 3 years to complete. The process had involved establishing a credible background, obtaining legitimate nursing credentials, and most importantly, learning to suppress the hypervigilance that had kept her alive for so many years. The hardest part had been learning to trust that her new identity was solid enough to withstand casual scrutiny. Working at the hospital had initially been a practical choice. Hospitals operated 24 hours a day, providing natural cover for irregular schedules. The night shift attracted people who preferred to avoid attention, and medical facilities offered access to resources that might prove useful if her past ever caught up with her. What she hadn't expected was how much she would genuinely care about the work. Children had always been her weakness, even in her previous life. Perhaps that's why she had gravitated toward pediatric nursing. Taking care of sick children felt like penance for the things she had done before, a way to balance some cosmic scale that probably didn't exist but made her feel marginally better about sleeping at night. Her supervisor, Linda Rodriguez, often praised Sarah's intuitive understanding of her young patients. Sarah had an uncanny ability to calm frightened children and seemed to know instinctively when a child's condition was more serious than it appeared. What Linda didn't realize was that this intuition came from years of reading people's micro-expressions, of knowing when someone was hiding pain or fear. The night shift suited Sarah's need for relative isolation while still allowing her to help people. During the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, she could move through her duties with minimal interaction. The emergency department still saw its share of action, but the general atmosphere was calmer, more manageable for someone trying to maintain a low profile. Her fellow nurses respected her competence, but had given up trying to include her in their social activities. Sarah always had polite excuses for declining invitations to birthday parties, holiday gatherings, or after-work drinks. They had learned to appreciate her reliability and professional skill while accepting that she simply wasn't interested in friendship. This careful distance served Sarah well until the night everything began to change. It started with a simple staff meeting that ran longer than usual, pushing the beginning of her shift back by an hour. The delayed start meant that instead of beginning her rounds during the usual quiet period, she found herself in the break room with the evening shift staff who were just finishing up. The break room at St. Mary's was a small, windowless space with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Mismatched chairs surrounded a scratch table where someone had left behind a deck of cards and several nursing journals. The coffee machine in the corner wheezed and gurgled constantly, producing a barely drinkable brew that somehow kept the entire night shift functioning. Sarah had intended to grab a quick cup of coffee and retreat to begin her rounds, but the evening shift was in the middle of what appeared to be a light-hearted conversation. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of the younger residents, was regaling the group with stories from his weekend, including what sounded like a disastrous attempt at online dating. "I swear she spent the entire dinner talking about her ex-boyfriend's criminal record," Marcus was saying, shaking his head in mock despair. Apparently, he had been arrested for assault 3 times, but she kept insisting he was really a good guy who just had anger management issues. Several of the nurses laughed, and someone made a comment about the poor judgment people showed when it came to relationships. Sarah paused in preparing her coffee, caught despite herself by the familiar territory of the conversation. "That's nothing," said Jennifer Walsh, one of the day shift nurses who had stayed late to finish paperwork. "My sister's been dating this guy who she swears is completely reformed, but last week she found a gun in his apartment. When she asked about it, he told her it was for protection, but she's convinced he used to be involved in some pretty serious criminal activity." The conversation continued around the table, with each person contributing their own story about friends or family members who had become involved with people of questionable background. Sarah found herself lingering longer than she had intended, fascinated by how casually they discussed things that had once been her everyday reality. "The scary thing is," said Rita Gonzalez, an intensive care nurse with 20 years of experience, "you never really know what someone is capable of. I mean, look at that case a few years ago where the suburban mom turned out to be running a drug operation out of her house. Her neighbors had no idea." Several people nodded in agreement, and Marcus leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. "It makes you wonder about people you know, doesn't it? Like, what if someone you work with every day had some dark secret in their past?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah felt her muscles tense involuntarily. This was exactly the kind of conversation she had spent 3 years learning to avoid. She should have left immediately, but something kept her rooted to the spot beside the coffee machine. "Oh, come on," laughed Jennifer. "What are you suggesting, that one of us is secretly a criminal mastermind? Look around this room, Marcus. We're all boring medical professionals who spend our free time binge-watching Netflix and worrying about student loan payments." The group laughed again, and Sarah forced herself to join in with a weak smile. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory, but she couldn't bring herself to leave without appearing suspicious. Instead, she finished preparing her coffee and took a seat at the edge of the group, hoping they would move on to a different topic. But Marcus seemed to be warming to his theme. "I'm serious, though. Think about it. The perfect cover for someone with a criminal background would be a respectable job like nursing or teaching. Who would suspect the person taking care of sick children?" Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee cup, and she forced herself to take a slow sip to hide her reaction. This conversation was hitting far too close to home, and she needed to find a way to redirect it or excuse herself without drawing attention. "You watch too many crime shows," Rita said, but there was an intrigued tone in her voice. "Though I suppose it's true that some of the most dangerous people are the ones who seem completely normal on the surface." "Exactly," Marcus said, clearly enjoying the theoretical discussion. "The really scary ones are the ones who can blend in perfectly. They could be anyone. They could be sitting right here with us, and we'd never know." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. The conversation had moved from general speculation to something that felt like a direct threat to her carefully constructed new life. She needed to leave immediately. But standing up now would only draw more attention to herself. Instead, she found herself speaking up, her voice carefully modulated to sound casually interested rather than defensive. What makes you think someone like that would choose nursing? Seems like there would be easier ways to hide. Marcus turned toward her with enthusiasm, clearly pleased to have engaged someone new in his theoretical discussion. That's exactly what makes it so perfect. Nobody suspects the helper, right? Plus, medical professionals have access to all sorts of things that could be useful for someone with criminal intentions. Drugs, medical equipment, detailed knowledge of human anatomy.
The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah.
He was describing with uncomfortable accuracy many of the reasons she had originally chosen her current profession. The difference was that her intentions were entirely defensive. She wanted access to medical resources in case she was injured and couldn't seek conventional treatment. She wanted the respectability that came with being a nurse. Most importantly, she wanted to help people as a way of making amends for her past. But Marcus's speculation was hitting too close to the truth, and she could feel her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. The smart thing would be to make an excuse and leave immediately. Instead, she found herself responding with a question that she would later realize was her first step toward disaster. So what would you do if you found out someone you knew had that kind of background? Like, hypothetically, if you discovered that someone you worked with used to be involved in serious criminal activity? The question seemed innocent enough, but Sarah realized immediately that she had made a mistake. By engaging with the conversation instead of deflecting it, she had only encouraged Marcus to continue down this dangerous path of speculation. Marcus's eyes lit up at Sarah's question, and she immediately regretted opening this door. The other nurses around the table leaned in slightly, drawn into what they perceived as an entertaining hypothetical discussion. For them, this was just workplace gossip with a theoretical twist. For Sarah, it was becoming a minefield she would have to navigate very carefully. "Well," Marcus said, settling back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had given this considerable thought, "I think you'd have to consider the nature of their past activities. I mean, there's a big difference between someone who used to steal cars and someone who was involved in violent crime." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. Context matters. And you'd have to think about whether they had genuinely changed or if they were just hiding their time." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. These people were discussing her life as if it were a plot from a television show, completely unaware that they were sitting 3 feet away from someone who embodied their hypothetical scenario. "The thing is," Rita added, stirring cream into her coffee, "people don't really change, do they? I mean, someone who was capable of serious violence once is probably still capable of it. They might suppress it for a while, but under the right circumstances, those old patterns would resurface." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years trying to convince herself that she had genuinely changed, that the person she used to be was buried so deeply that she would never resurface. But Rita's casual assertion echoed doubts that kept Sarah awake during the few hours she wasn't working. "I don't know about that," said Tom Bradley, a male nurse from the cardiac unit who had been quietly listening to the conversation. "I think people can change if they really want to. Look at all the former gang members who become community activists, or ex-addicts who dedicate their lives to helping other people get clean." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward Tom, even though she knew he was just expressing a general philosophical position rather than defending her specifically. Still, it was reassuring to hear someone argue that redemption was possible. Marcus shook his head dismissively. "That's different, though. Gang activity and drug addiction are often crimes of circumstance or desperation. I'm talking about someone who was genuinely dangerous, someone who killed people for money or revenge or just because they enjoyed it." The casual way he said the word killed made Sarah's coffee taste like acid in her mouth. She set down her cup carefully, afraid that her trembling hands might betray her emotional state. The conversation had moved from uncomfortable to genuinely threatening, and she needed to find a way out before someone noticed her reaction. "You're being awfully specific," Jennifer said with a laugh. "Are you working on a novel or something? Because this is starting to sound like you have a particular scenario in mind." Marcus grinned sheepishly. "Actually, I've been binge-watching this crime documentary series about female assassins. It's fascinating how many of them managed to live completely normal lives between jobs. Some of them had families, regular jobs, the whole suburban lifestyle." Sarah's blood ran cold. Of all the topics Marcus could have chosen to focus on, this was perhaps the worst possible direction for the conversation to take. She had hoped he was speaking in general terms about criminal activity, but his specific mention of female assassins felt like the universe conspiring against her. Female assassins? Rita raised an eyebrow. That seems like it would be pretty rare. I mean, most violent crime is committed by men, right? That's exactly what makes them so effective, Marcus said, warming to his subject. Nobody suspects a woman, especially not a woman in a caring profession like nursing or teaching. The documentary mentions several cases where women used their access to hospitals or schools to eliminate their targets. Sarah realized she had stopped breathing. She forced herself to take a slow, quiet breath while Marcus continued his enthusiastic description of what sounded uncomfortably like her former life. The really interesting thing is how they maintained their cover, identities. Some of them worked the same jobs for years, building relationships with colleagues who never suspected anything. They were described as quiet, reliable, professional, the kind of people you'd trust with your life. The irony of his words wasn't lost on anyone at the table, though only Sarah understood the full implications. She was exactly the kind of person he was describing, sitting right there among colleagues who did in fact trust her with their lives on a regular basis. Okay, this is getting creepy, Jennifer said with a nervous laugh. You're making me look at everyone differently now. Like, what if our quiet, mysterious Sarah here has a secret life as an international woman of mystery? The comment was clearly meant as a joke, but Sarah felt as if someone had just shone a spotlight on her. Several pairs of eyes turned toward her, and she realized she had become the focus of attention in exactly the way she had spent years trying to avoid. Oh, come on, Tom said with a dismissive wave. Sarah's the most harmless person in this hospital. She spends her breaks reading medical journals and talking about her cat. Sarah managed a weak smile and forced herself to play along with what everyone assumed was good-natured teasing. You caught me, she said, trying to keep her voice light. International assassin by night, pediatric nurse by day. It's all about work-life balance. The group laughed, and Sarah felt a moment of relief. Her self-deprecating response had apparently deflected suspicion successfully. But Marcus wasn't ready to let the subject drop entirely. All joking aside, though, he said, leaning forward with renewed interest. What would be the perfect cover for someone in that line of work? I mean, if you really wanted to blend in and avoid suspicion? Sarah realized that Marcus was treating this as an intellectual puzzle, unaware that he was asking someone with first-hand experience to analyze her own survival strategy. The question put her in an impossible position. If she refused to engage, she might seem suspicious. If she participated too enthusiastically, she might reveal more than she intended. I think you're overthinking it, she said carefully. Most people just want to live their lives without drama. They're not really looking for hidden criminals among their coworkers. But Marcus seemed energized by the discussion and wasn't ready to let it go. No, but seriously, think about it from a practical standpoint. What profession would give you the best combination of respectability, mobility, and access to resources? Despite herself, Sarah found her professional instincts taking over. This was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had kept her alive for years, and Marcus was asking her to apply those skills to a theoretical problem that was actually her life story. Well, she said slowly, you'd want something that provided a good reason to work irregular hours. Something that involved travel or shift work so people wouldn't question your schedule or whereabouts. Exactly, Marcus said with excitement. And healthcare is perfect for that. Plus, you'd have access to medical supplies, knowledge of anatomy and physiology, and natural opportunities to approach targets in vulnerable situations. Sarah realized she had made another mistake. By engaging with his analysis, she was inadvertently confirming the accuracy of his speculation. But the conversation had developed its own momentum, and the other nurses were now actively participating in what they saw as an entertaining thought experiment. You'd also want to choose somewhere that didn't require extensive background checks, Jennifer added. I mean, most healthcare positions do check your credentials, but they're mainly looking at your education and licensing, not your personal history. Rita nodded thoughtfully. And you'd want to avoid positions with high visibility. No management roles, nothing that would put you in the spotlight or require you to give presentations or interviews. Sarah felt sick as she listened to her colleagues systematically describe her own cover strategy. They were treating it as a fun intellectual exercise, but they were basically reverse engineering her entire approach to hiding in plain sight. The most important thing would be choosing the right personality to project, Tom said. You'd want to seem completely harmless and unremarkable. Quiet, maybe a little shy, definitely not the type of person who would draw attention or make people curious about your background. The description hit uncomfortably close to how Sarah knew her colleagues perceived her. She had worked so hard to cultivate exactly that image, and now she was watching them analyze it as a criminal strategy, rather than recognizing it as the defensive mechanism it had become. Marcus was practically vibrating with enthusiasm at this point. And you'd want to choose a specialty that involved taking care of people, because it would be the ultimate irony. Someone whose job was supposedly to preserve life, but who had actually taken it. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily under the table. Marcus was describing her situation with disturbing accuracy, but his casual tone suggested he had no idea how personal his analysis had become. Okay, this is getting really dark, Jennifer said, though she was still smiling. Maybe we should change the subject before we start suspecting each other of being secret killers. But Marcus held up a hand, clearly not ready to abandon his favorite topic. Wait, I have one more question, and this is the really interesting part from a psychological standpoint. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had been hoping the conversation would naturally wind down, but Marcus seemed determined to push it even further into dangerous territory. If someone really did have that kind of background, and they were trying to live a normal life now, what do you think their biggest vulnerability would be? I mean, what would trip them up and expose their true identity?
The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that everyone at the table was looking at her expectantly.
Somehow, without meaning to, she had become the designated expert on this hypothetical scenario. They wanted her to analyze the weaknesses in a cover identity that was essentially her own. Sarah felt trapped between competing instincts. Her survival training told her to deflect the question and excuse herself from the conversation immediately. But another part of her, the part that had been isolated and alone for 3 years, was perversely curious to hear herself think through these issues out loud. I suppose, she said carefully, the biggest risk would be someone from their past recognizing them, or maybe getting too comfortable and letting their guard down. Marcus nodded eagerly. Right, but what about their behavior patterns? I mean, someone with that kind of background would have reflexes and instincts that would be hard to suppress completely. They'd probably be hyper-aware of their surroundings, skilled at reading people's intentions, maybe unusually knowledgeable about things that don't normally come up in everyday conversation. Sarah felt as if Marcus was systematically dismantling her carefully constructed identity, pointing out all the ways she probably didn't fit in as well as she thought she did. Had her colleagues noticed these things about her? Were there telltale signs she had missed? You know what the really interesting question would be? Marcus continued, clearly enjoying his role as amateur profiler. If you suspected someone you knew had that kind of background, how would you test your theory? The question sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Was this still theoretical for Marcus, or had he noticed something about her that had sparked his suspicion? She searched his face for any sign that his questions were directed specifically at her, but he seemed genuinely caught up in the intellectual exercise. That's easy, Rita said with a laugh. You'd ask them about their past. Most people love talking about themselves, sharing stories about where they grew up, their family, their college experiences. Someone with a fabricated identity would probably try to keep that conversation short and vague. Sarah realized with growing horror that Rita was describing exactly how she handled personal questions from her colleagues. She had always deflected inquiries about her background, claiming she preferred not to dwell on the past, or that her family situation was complicated. Or you could ask them about their hobbies and interests, Tom suggested. Someone who spent years focused on criminal activity might not have normal recreational pursuits. They might not know enough about regular hobbies to maintain a convincing conversation. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully, and they'd probably be uncomfortable with spontaneous social activities. Someone living under a false identity would want to maintain control over their schedule and interactions. Sarah felt as if her colleagues were conducting a postmortem on her social behavior, identifying all the ways she had inadvertently revealed her true nature. She had thought she was being appropriately private and professional, but apparently her avoidance strategies were more obvious than she had realized. The ultimate test, though, Marcus said with a grin, would be to ask them directly about their past in a way that caught them completely off guard. Most people would be confused or offended by the question, but someone with something to hide might react differently.
Like how? Jennifer asked, clearly intrigued by the psychological aspects of Marcus's scenario. Marcus leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention his analysis was receiving.
Well, you'd want to phrase it as a joke so they couldn't be sure if you were serious or not. Something casual and unexpected that would catch them before they could prepare their usual response. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she realized where this conversation was heading. Marcus was describing exactly the kind of situation she had trained herself to handle, but in a context where her usual defensive responses would only confirm suspicion. For example, Marcus continued, you might jokingly ask them about their kill count or something like that. Make it sound like you're just being dramatic or referencing a movie. Most normal people would either laugh or look confused, but someone with real experience might react in a way that revealed more than they intended.
The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Marcus had just described the exact scenario that would be most dangerous for her, phrased as an innocent joke, but designed to expose the kind of person she used to be. She realized that everyone at the table was looking at her again, and she had the terrible feeling that Marcus's suggestion was about to stop being theoretical. The silence that followed Marcus's suggestion stretched for what felt like an eternity. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's attention, and she realized with growing dread that the conversation had shifted from theoretical discussion to something that felt suspiciously like a setup. The casual way Marcus had proposed his test made her wonder if this entire conversation had been leading to this moment. Jennifer was the first to break the silence, letting out a nervous laugh.
Marcus, that's terrible. You can't just ask people about their kill count. That's not a normal thing to joke about.
Why not?
Marcus said with a shrug that seemed too casual to be genuine. It's just a phrase from video games and movies. Most people would get the reference and either play along with the joke or tell you you're being ridiculous.
Rita shook her head with a disapproving expression. It's inappropriate workplace conversation, even as a joke.
Can you imagine if a patient or a family member overheard something like that? Sarah felt a flicker of hope that the conversation would be derailed by concerns about professional conduct, but Marcus seemed determined to pursue his point. Come on, it's just us here. And it's not like I'm suggesting we actually interrogate anyone. I'm just saying that if you really wanted to test whether someone was hiding something about their past, that kind of unexpected question might reveal something interesting.
Tom frowned thoughtfully.
I don't know, Marcus. That seems like it could backfire pretty easily. What if you asked someone who had military experience, or someone who had lost family members to violence? You could end up triggering some really painful memories. That's actually a good point, Marcus acknowledged. You definitely want to be careful about context and timing, but in the right situation with the right person, it could be revealing. Sarah realized that her silence during this exchange was probably more noticeable than anything she could have said. She needed to contribute to the conversation in a way that seemed natural, but her mind was racing through the implications of Marcus's suggestion. I think Tom's right, she finally said, pleased that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Questions like that could be really hurtful to someone who's dealt with trauma or loss. It seems like a risky way to satisfy your curiosity about someone. Marcus turned toward her with renewed interest. That's true, but what if the person you were curious about seemed to have no emotional reactions to anything? Like, what if they were so controlled and detached that you wondered if they were capable of normal human responses? The question felt like an accusation, and Sarah realized that Marcus might have been observing her more carefully than she had thought. Her colleagues had often commented on her calm demeanor during medical emergencies, her ability to remain composed when dealing with difficult patients or tragic situations. She had thought they saw it as professional competence, but perhaps some of them had noticed that her emotional responses seemed muted compared to those of her colleagues. Some people just process emotions differently, Tom said defensively, and Sarah wondered if he was thinking of her specifically. That doesn't mean they're hiding something sinister. It might just mean they've learned to compartmentalize as a coping mechanism. Jennifer nodded in agreement. Exactly. And honestly, in our line of work, having someone who can stay calm under pressure is valuable. I'd rather work with someone who keeps their emotions in check than someone who falls apart every time we lose a patient. Sarah felt grateful for their unknowing support, but she could see that Marcus wasn't convinced. There was something in his expression that suggested he had moved beyond theoretical speculation into actual suspicion.
All right, Marcus said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Let's test the theory. Sarah, you're the calmest person I know, and you never talk about your past. What's your kill count? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt her training kick in automatically. Every instinct she had developed over years of dangerous situations was screaming at her to assess the threat, plan her response, and prepare for potential consequences. But those same instincts were exactly what would betray her if she wasn't careful. She could feel everyone at the table watching her reaction, and she knew that her response to this moment would determine whether her carefully constructed new life would survive. The smart thing would be to laugh it off, express confusion about the question, or redirect the conversation away from herself. Instead, she found herself studying Marcus's face with the kind of analytical intensity that had once been essential for survival. She was reading his micro-expressions, assessing his body language, trying to determine whether his question was motivated by genuine suspicion or just misguided curiosity. The problem was that this level of scrutiny was exactly the kind of behavior that would confirm Marcus's suspicions about her. Normal people didn't analyze their colleagues for signs of deception when asked a random question. Normal people didn't automatically categorize potential threats and plan defensive strategies during casual workplace conversations. Sarah realized she had been silent for too long, and that her prolonged pause was probably being interpreted as evidence that Marcus had struck a nerve. She needed to respond, but every option felt like a trap. "That's not funny, Marcus," she said finally, trying to inject the right note of bewildered offense into her voice. "What kind of question is that?" But even as she spoke, she could tell that her response hadn't been quite right. Her tone was controlled rather than genuinely upset, and her facial expression was more guarded than confused. Someone who was truly innocent of Marcus's implications would have reacted with more authentic emotion. "See?" Marcus said, leaning forward with obvious excitement. "That's exactly what I was talking about. Most people would have laughed or told me I was crazy, but Sarah's response was measured and careful, like she was thinking about how to handle the question." Rita looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Marcus, you're being ridiculous." Sarah responded exactly like any sensible person would to an inappropriate question. But Jennifer was studying Sarah with new interest, and Sarah could see the seeds of suspicion taking root. Actually, it was kind of a weird response. I mean, if someone asked me that question, I think I would have laughed and made a joke about my video game skills or something. Tom shook his head firmly. "You're all reading way too much into this. Sarah doesn't play video games, so she probably didn't get the reference. And she's right that it's an inappropriate thing to ask at work." Sarah appreciated Tom's continued defense, but she could see that Marcus had succeeded in planting doubt in the group. What had started as a theoretical discussion about criminal behavior had somehow evolved into a real-time analysis of her reactions and behavior patterns. "Okay, fine," Marcus said with a conciliatory gesture. "Maybe the question was too blunt, but I still think there's something interesting about how different people respond to unexpected situations." Sarah hoped the conversation was finally moving away from her, but Marcus wasn't finished. "Actually, let me try a different approach. Sarah, humor me for a second. If someone really did ask you about your kill count, and you wanted to give them an honest answer, what would you say?" The question was cleverly phrased. Marcus was asking her to engage with the hypothetical scenario while simultaneously probing for her real response. It was the kind of psychological technique that might have been effective against someone without her training. "I'd say you watch too many crime shows," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "And that you should probably find a new hobby that doesn't involve interrogating your coworkers about imaginary murders." Several people laughed, and Sarah thought she might have successfully diffused the situation. But Marcus wasn't giving up. "Come on, play along, just for fun. If we're all being honest about hypothetical scenarios, what would your number be?" Sarah realized that Marcus was going to keep pushing until he got some kind of response, and that continuing to deflect would only make her seem more suspicious. She needed to give him an answer that would satisfy his curiosity while maintaining her cover. "Fine," she said with an exaggerated sigh. "My kill count is 0, Marcus. I've never killed anyone. Not in video games, not in real life, not even in my imagination. I'm probably the least violent person you'll ever meet." The answer was technically true. Sarah had never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, and she had never taken a life without justification.
But the careful phrasing of her response was another mistake, one that Marcus immediately seized upon. "That's interesting," he said thoughtfully. "You said you've never killed anyone who didn't deserve it. That's a pretty specific qualifier." Sarah felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. She had fallen into exactly the kind of trap she had spent years learning to avoid. Revealing information through the way she structured her denial rather than through what she actually said. "I didn't say that," she protested, but she could see from the expressions around the table that several people had caught the same implication Marcus had identified. "Actually, I think you did," Jennifer said slowly. "You said you'd never killed anyone who didn't deserve it, which implies that you've thought about who might deserve killing." Sarah realized that the conversation had crossed a line from which there was no easy retreat. Her colleagues were no longer engaging in theoretical speculation about criminal behavior. They were actively questioning whether she might be the kind of person they had been discussing. "You're all being ridiculous," she said, standing up abruptly from the table. "This conversation started as a joke, and now you're acting like I'm some kind of serial killer. I have patients to check on." But her sudden movement to leave only reinforced the impression that she was trying to escape uncomfortable questions. Tom looked genuinely concerned. Rita appeared confused by the turn the conversation had taken, and Jennifer was watching Sarah with obvious suspicion. Marcus remained seated, but there was a triumphant expression on his face that made Sarah's stomach turn. "Sarah, wait. I'm sorry if we upset you. We're just having a conversation." "No, you're not," Sarah said, her voice sharper than she intended. "You're conducting some kind of amateur psychology experiment, and I'm not interested in being your test subject." She turned toward the door, but Marcus's next word stopped her cold. "Just one more question and then I'll drop the whole thing, I promise." Against her better judgment, Sarah turned back toward the table. She could see that everyone was watching this interaction with fascination, as if they were witnessing some kind of dramatic revelation. "What?" she asked, though she already suspected she didn't want to hear the answer. Marcus looked directly at her, and Sarah could see that any pretense of casual curiosity had disappeared. His expression was serious, almost predatory. "If you really had to give an honest answer about your kill count, what would it be? Not 0, right? 'Cause someone with your background, your skills, your way of moving through the world, I don't think 0 is accurate." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah realized that Marcus had been building to this moment throughout the entire conversation. This wasn't a casual workplace discussion that had gotten out of hand. This was a deliberate interrogation, designed to expose her true identity. She looked around the table at her colleagues, people she had worked beside for 3 years, people who had trusted her with their patients and their professional responsibilities. She could see confusion, concern, and growing suspicion in their faces. Sarah knew that her next words would determine whether her carefully constructed new life would survive, or whether everything she had built would come crashing down around her. The smart response would be to maintain her denial, express outrage at the continued questioning, and leave immediately. Instead, she found herself looking directly at Marcus, and for the first time in 3 years, she let her guard down completely. 17, she said quietly. The single word fell into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Sarah could see the shock on their faces as they processed what she had just admitted. She had just confirmed their worst suspicions about her, destroyed her cover identity, and potentially put herself in danger from people who might decide she was too much of a threat to work alongside. But after 3 years of carefully maintained lies, there was something almost liberating about finally telling the truth. The silence that followed Sarah's confession stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. She watched as her colleagues processed what she had just told them, their faces cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. Rita was the first to find her voice. 17 what? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and was desperately hoping to be wrong. Sarah looked around the table one more time, taking in the faces of people she had come to respect and in some cases genuinely care about. Tom's expression showed hurt and betrayal alongside the shock. Jennifer had pushed her chair back slightly, as if creating distance would somehow protect her. Marcus looked simultaneously vindicated and terrified, as if he had been playing with fire without really expecting to get burned. 17 people, Sarah said quietly, over the course of 8 years. The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah could see her colleagues struggling to reconcile this revelation with the person they thought they knew. The quiet, competent nurse who had worked alongside them for 3 years was suddenly revealed to be something they had only encountered in movies and crime documentaries. Jennifer stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone jump. I have to, she stammered, then turned and fled from the break room without finishing her sentence. Rita remained seated but had gone pale. Sarah, please tell me this is some kind of sick joke. Please tell me you're not serious. Sarah wished she could take it back, wished she could laugh and claim it had all been an elaborate response to Marcus's ridiculous questions, but the truth was out now, and she found herself strangely reluctant to retreat back into deception. It's not a joke, she said simply, but it's not what you think either. Marcus leaned forward, his earlier excitement replaced by genuine nervousness. What do you mean it's not what we think? You just admitted to killing 17 people. I admitted to a number, Sarah corrected. I didn't provide context. Tom, who had been silent since her confession, finally spoke up. His voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the strain underneath. What context could possibly make that okay, Sarah? What context justifies 17 deaths? The question hit harder than the others because it came from Tom, who had consistently defended her throughout the evening. She could see that her revelation had shattered something in him, and she realized that her confession had consequences beyond her own exposure. They were all bad people, she said, knowing how inadequate the explanation sounded, but needing to try. People who hurt children, who trafficked women, who destroyed lives for profit. I didn't kill innocent people. Rita shook her head slowly. That's not how it works, Sarah. You can't just decide who deserves to die and then execute them. That's not justice, that's vigilante murder. Sarah felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest. These were good people, but they lived in a world where the legal system functioned, where police could be trusted to protect the innocent, where justice was more than just a theoretical concept. The legal system failed those victims, she said, her voice gaining strength. The people I eliminated were untouchable through conventional channels. They had money, connections, protection. Children were dying while these people lived in luxury. Marcus was studying her with horrified fascination. So you just what? Decided to become judge, jury, and executioner? I was recruited, Sarah said, surprising herself by continuing to reveal information that she had never intended to share. There was an organization that identified people who had fallen through the cracks of the justice system, people whose crimes were well documented, but who couldn't be touched through legal channels. Tom's expression shifted from hurt to something approaching revulsion. An organization? You're talking about some kind of assassination squad. We called ourselves problem solvers, Sarah said, aware of how naive that sounded in retrospect. We believed we were protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the hallway, and everyone at the table tensed. Jennifer had left nearly 10 minutes ago, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that she might have gone to alert security or administration about what she had heard. But it was only David Kim, one of the night shift orderlies, poking his head into the break room to grab something from his locker. He nodded politely at the group and went about his business, apparently oblivious to the tension in the room. After David left, Rita leaned forward and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Sarah, do you understand what you've just told us? Do you realize the position you've put us in? Sarah felt a chill as she began to understand the implications of her confession. Her colleagues weren't just shocked by her revelation. They were grappling with their legal and ethical obligations now that they possessed this information. You're mandatory reporters, she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. You're required to report suspected criminal activity. Tom nodded grimly. We can't just pretend we didn't hear this, Sarah. Even if we wanted to, we have professional and legal obligations. Marcus looked genuinely distressed now, as if he was beginning to regret pushing for answers to questions that had seemed merely theoretical an hour ago. This wasn't supposed to be real, he said quietly. This was supposed to be hypothetical. Sarah found herself studying the faces around the table with the same analytical intensity she had once applied to potential threats. She was calculating how much time she had before they made their decision, how quickly she could disappear if necessary, what resources she would need to vanish completely. But even as her survival instincts kicked in, another part of her felt an unexpected sense of relief. She had spent 3 years maintaining a false identity, carefully controlling every interaction, never allowing herself to form genuine connections with the people around her. The isolation had been necessary for her safety, but it had also been slowly destroying her.
"I know you have obligations," she said finally. "I understand that you can't just ignore what I've told you. But I need you to understand that the person who did those things doesn't exist anymore." Rita's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm.
"That's not how it works, Sarah. You can't just reinvent yourself and expect the past to disappear." "I'm not the same person I was 8 years ago," Sarah insisted. "I left that organization. I created a new identity. I've spent 3 years trying to make amends by helping people instead of hurting them." Tom shook his head sadly. "That's admirable, Sarah. But it doesn't erase what you did. 17 people are still dead because of your actions." The conversation was interrupted again, this time by the return of Jennifer. She entered the break room with 2 security guards and Dr. Patricia Chen, the night shift supervisor. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her confession was about to become much more complicated.
"Is there a problem here?" Dr. Chen asked, looking around the table with obvious concern.
Jennifer looked pale but determined. "I think you need to hear what Sarah just told us." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her as she realized that her moment of honesty was about to destroy everything she had built. But instead of panic, she found herself feeling strangely calm. After 3 years of constantly looking over her shoulder, there was something almost peaceful about finally being exposed. "Actually," she said, standing up slowly with her hands visible, "I think I should probably explain this myself." Chen frowned, clearly confused by the tension in the room. "Explain what, Sarah?" Sarah looked around at her colleagues one more time, taking in their expressions of fear, disappointment, and betrayal. These were good people who had been forced into an impossible situation by her carelessness. They didn't deserve to be burdened with her secrets. "My name isn't really Sarah Martinez," she began, her voice steady and clear. "And my background isn't what you think it is." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself telling a story she had never expected to share. She explained how she had been recruited at 19 by an organization that claimed to pursue justice outside the bounds of the legal system. She described the training, the missions, the gradual realization that she was being used by people whose motives were far more complex than they had initially appeared. She told them about the children's hospital in Romania, where she had discovered that her target was actually trying to expose a trafficking ring, not participate in it. She described the moment when she realized she had been manipulated into eliminating someone who was fighting the same battles she thought she was fighting. "That's when I knew I had to get out," she said, looking directly at Dr. Chen. "But leaving that organization isn't like quitting a regular job. They don't give you a retirement party and a gold watch." Dr. Chen had been taking notes throughout Sarah's explanation, and her expression had shifted from confusion to professional concern. "How did you manage to extract yourself from that situation?" "Very carefully," Sarah said with a bitter smile, "and with a lot of help from people who believed I deserved a second chance. It took 2 years to establish a new identity that would hold up to scrutiny, and another year to get the credentials I needed to work in healthcare." Marcus, who had been silent throughout most of Sarah's extended confession, finally spoke up. "Why healthcare? Why choose a profession dedicated to saving lives after spending years taking them?" The question struck at something Sarah had been struggling with since her first day at St. Mary's. "Because I needed to prove to myself that I could be someone different. I needed to know that my hands could heal instead of destroy." Rita had been listening with obvious internal conflict, and Sarah could see that she was struggling to reconcile her professional obligations with what appeared to be genuine sympathy for Sarah's situation. "The children you've worked with here," Rita said quietly. "You've been genuinely helping them. I've watched you with the scared ones, the angry ones, the ones who've been through terrible things. You connect with them in a way that most of us can't." Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time that evening. "Because I understand what it's like to have adults fail you. I understand what it's like to feel like the world is a dangerous place where nobody can be trusted to protect you." Dr. Chen closed her notebook and looked directly at Sarah. "You understand that I have to contact the authorities, don't you? I don't have a choice in this matter." Sarah nodded. I understand. And I want you to know that I won't run. I'm tired of running. Tom looked surprised. You're not going to try to disappear? You could probably be gone before the police arrive. I could, Sarah agreed. I have contingency plans, resources, skills that would make it very difficult to track me down. But I'm tired of being someone I'm not. I'm tired of being alone. The admission surprised everyone at the table, including Sarah herself. She hadn't realized until she said it that the isolation had become more painful than the fear of discovery. Dr. Chen picked up the phone to make the necessary calls, and Sarah found herself surrounded by the strange quiet that comes before everything changes forever. She looked around at her colleagues, people she had worked with for 3 years without ever really knowing them or allowing them to know her. For what it's worth, she said quietly, being Sarah Martinez, working with all of you, taking care of those children, these have been the best 3 years of my life. Tom's expression softened, though he still looked deeply troubled. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. I think I'm past the point of lying, Sarah said with a weak smile. The children we've treated together, the families we've worked with, were any of them ever in danger from your past? Was anyone here at risk because of who you used to be? The question had been haunting Sarah for 3 years, the constant fear that her presence might somehow endanger the innocent people around her. No, she said firmly. I chose this identity carefully, to ensure that my past couldn't touch this place or these people. The organization I worked for was disbanded years ago, and the few people who knew my real identity believe I'm dead. Rita looked puzzled. They believe you're dead? It was the only way to ensure a clean break, Sarah explained. As far as the world is concerned, the person I used to be died in a car accident in Prague 5 years ago. The revelation prompted more questions, but they were interrupted by the arrival of the police. As Dr. Chen led 2 detectives into the break room, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion. Her carefully constructed new life was ending, but for the first time in years, she was facing the future as herself rather than as an elaborate fiction. The questioning that followed was thorough but not hostile. The detectives seemed more fascinated than threatened by her story, and Sarah found herself appreciating their professionalism. They were clearly trying to determine whether she represented an ongoing threat to public safety or was simply someone whose past had finally caught up with her. As they prepared to take her into custody, Sarah turned back to her colleagues one final time. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry for lying to you, for putting you in this position, for not being the person you thought I was. Tom stepped forward, despite the obvious disapproval of the detectives. Sarah, I need you to know something. These past 3 years, working with you, watching you with those kids, that person was real. Maybe your name was fake and your background was fabricated, but the nurse who stayed late to comfort a frightened child, who fought for better pain management protocols, who actually cared about making those kids feel safe, that person was real. Sarah felt tears finally starting to fall as she realized that Tom was right. The identity might have been constructed, but the person she had become within that identity was genuine. She had spent 3 years becoming someone worthy of the name she had chosen, someone who could look at herself in the mirror without shame. As the police led her away from St. Mary's Hospital for the last time, Sarah found herself thinking about the children she had cared for, the colleagues who had unknowingly helped her become a better person, and the strange journey that had brought her from a life of violence to a moment of genuine human connection. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she was facing it as herself rather than as a carefully constructed lie. And despite everything that was about to happen, that felt like a kind of victory.